About 30 years ago or so, an anti-racism trainer asked me a question, said, why is it in your self-interest to combat racism? What's in it for you? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know. And I came up with something. I stammered out something, but I've been working on it for a long time now, for many years. And when Reverend Bloom, I don't know, somehow we got talking about this, and he said, come talk about it at my church. And it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about it. It's a deeply spiritual issue to think about what's in it for us, white people. I want to talk to white people today. I want to talk about what's in it for us. Why is it in our self-interest to deal with racism, to end racism? So I told Bill that's what I'd talk about. But first we have to make sure we're on the same page. I want to just preface some things. I got a couple of stories to tell before we really get to the meat of this. I was at another anti-racism training years ago. Actually, I was leading it with a friend. We asked the question, can white people as a group be racist? If so, how? Well, it was kind of a group like this, and it was all white people. And then raised their hand. Everybody raised their hand, seemed like. Everybody had an example. It was not hard at all for people to come up with examples of ways in which white people as a group enact racism. People said, well, the inequitable funding of schools, police that harass and arrest Black kids more than white kids. One person after another gave examples. Real estate people who steer people to particular houses, but not to others. And on the examples came quickly and easily. Just people had no problem with it. And then we asked, can Black people as a group be racist? And if so, how? Again, most of the people in the room raised their hand, said yes, that's possible. And then we said, so how? Give us some examples. And it wasn't so easy. People said, well, let's see. And they struggled to illustrate how. But some people gave examples of individual prejudice. Well, I know somebody who treated me this way. I said, well, that's not as a group, right? And said, well, yeah, okay. And they tried to, we said, we're talking about where people have power over as a group. How? Give us some examples of that. And, excuse me. And they, so people tried to think about where Black people have power over white folks. They said, they started thinking about that. I said, well, there's a lot of Black mayors. There's Black police officers. These days, there's more and more power in the Black community. And we said, so how is that? How do they have power over white people in a way that oppresses them, that puts them down? And they said, well, they thought about it for a while, and they thought, yeah, truth is that Black mayors and Black police officers, they kind of reinforce the system the way it is, rather than reverse the scales. And so we thought about that for a while, and finally there was one person left who was still insisting that that Black people as a group have, enact racism on white people. And he was really insistent. He said, well, some Black people hate white people. It's just a general feeling. I said, well, okay, we're not going to convince this guy. But I wanted to start there just to be, even though the group that I was in before worship here was talking about Ibram Kendi's book and about racism. And, we probably are working on having a general understanding of systemic racism and how it works and how it doesn't. But with each, it's not easy for us to get our head around it. It's not easy for us to understand how racism works in the society, especially for us as white people, because we don't see it. We don't see it a lot of times. It's invisible to us. And it's not just a feeling, it's a system in which we all live, we all participate, whether we like it or not. And it's a system where the power is mostly in the hands of white people. I was surprised how difficult it was for us white folks to see how pervasive and systemic racism is in our country. We resist the suggestion that racism is our problem and that we as white people need to be working on it. It's not easy for us to see that. We don't want to see it. It's not that white people are bad. It's not that that we're uniquely prejudiced. Everyone participates in systems of power and oppression, and all of us at some point in our lives are targeted, and all of us at some point are in non-targeted group. It's not a matter of blame. It's not a matter of shame. It's we all at one point or another find ourselves on the underside of prejudice, either as, women, LGBTQ plus people, white boys and girls, all boys and girls, at some point are targeted as students, it's just difficult being a kid sometimes. Students, elders, workers, we all find ourselves targeted at one point or another. We all know what it is to be on the underside and the receiving side of prejudice. And we all have been on the other side. All of us have experienced that piece. Men of all racial and ethnic groups in our society are part of a system that degrades and objectifies women in some ways. Straight people are part of a system that disadvantages LGBTQ people. We're all part of those systems, and the people who are targeted, who experience the disadvantages, are the ones most likely to see, most likely to challenge the oppression. Those of us who are in non-targeted positions often have trouble seeing or accepting the ways we participate in those systems. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we're together on this part, and sometimes it takes a long time to get together on this, let's get to what Reverend Bill asked me to talk about. He asked me specifically to talk about how racism has hurt white people, how it's hurt our souls and our soul force as white people, the benefit to white people of ending racism. As I said, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I didn't have an answer 30 years ago, but I have a lot of answers now. I got more than I could talk about this morning. as I've worked at it. And I would put it pretty strongly. Racism has been an absolute catastrophe for every single one of us. For every single one of us. And if I talk to any of you for long enough, I would be able to hear how it's been a catastrophe for you. Racism has been a catastrophe in our society that has hurt every one of us. And we could all, if we had enough time, come up with reasons and ways in which we would know that racism is death dealing for Black people, death dealing for people of color, but also that in our country, it is soul killing, debilitating for white people, for every one of us. Racism has harmed and continues to harm all of us. Any one of us would be able to come up with examples. So I began to collect examples over the years, and I've been working at it, trying to put them together, trying to think about, okay, what do these have in common? How is it that we would all benefit by ending racism? And how is it in our own self-interest? And over time, the examples coalesced into a few categories that I put into a mnemonic or an acronym. I don't know which it is, a mnemonic or an acronym, but it's one of those. And acronym's easier to say, so I use this acronym. The acronym that I use to help me remember it, and maybe it'll help you too, is the word DeBIT. D-E-B-I-T, DeBIT. It's helpful for me to remember these categories: denial, blindness, isolation, and terror. Denial, blindness, isolation or individualism, and terror. You notice I left the E out. There is an E in there that I also use, I'm not going to talk about this morning, stands for economics, which is also a catastrophe of racism, but more complicated to talk about. So this simple DeBIT acronym is meant to help us remember our self-interest in ending racism as white people. In fact, I just have time this morning to give you a few examples of each of those, or within each category. And I'm working on writing it down. Over time, maybe I'll share it at some point with you. But so first, racism is held in place by denial. It's held in place by denial, the conscious or unconscious ways that white people deny our personal and collective history. In the past few years, you'll notice, the past few years, attempts to teach Black history, to teach the whole history of our country. You may have heard, it's kind of controversial, that any attempt to tell the whole truth of our country, of our history, of our personal history is, I mean, people say, oh, they're communists. Well, no, it's just talking about our history. It's just saying truth about who we are. White people show up at school board meetings insisting that their children are being taught incorrectly. If there's simple things told about slavery or about our history. So I think it's in our self-interest to know our whole history. I think it's in our self-interest to know not just our history collectively, but our history personally. A lot of people are really into figuring out. I mean, I've been doing research into my history, my genealogy, and it's not unrelated to think about what our own personal history is, both the positive things about being Scottish or German or whatever it is, and the difficult parts. So, secondly, blindness. Sorry to rush through this, but blindness is closely related to denial, as you can imagine. I mean, in our scripture reading we read this morning, Jesus used blindness as an example in his ministry of how blind folks see, and those who are sighted become blind. And we white folks often talk about being blind in a particular way. You say, well, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. I have a friend who used to say that. I don't see color. And, you know, other Black friends would say to him, well, then you don't see me. You don't see my reality. You don't see what is going on in my life. If you're colorblind, you don't really know my reality. Because we live in a society that does see and treat Black people differently all the time. And third, let me mention how denial and blindness lead us, white people, to isolating ourselves, to living in gated communities, to keeping ourselves far away from the problems that racism has created. And so white people have tended to live in white communities, in particular areas. And segregation has been the result and has been debilitating, death dealing for Black people, but soul killing for white folks. And in the end, that isolation leads to living in fear. They don't always go that way. Sometimes our fear leads us to isolation, and they all interact with each other, all of these four things. But the fear deepens into a kind of terror, which we project onto the world. We project our terror out there and feel terrorized, feel scared because of what we project onto the world, and we see on the news every night, and it comes back to bite us, comes back to hurt us. I hope these categories are resonating with you. I hope that it might be something you could use, and I encourage you to do your own exploration of the debit of racism in your life, the debilitating catastrophe that racism is for each one of us and all of us as a community. We white folks often ask what we can do about racism. I get that when we talk about this. What can we do? And the helpful thing about this acronym, DeBIT, is that it helps us think about what we can do. What we can do about racism, because it doesn't work we want, I don't know, I find we white people, we want something easy to do. We want something, can I just give money to this thing and make it go away? We think of racism as an issue. We talk about it in a class, we'll read a book, it's done with. I'm all right now. I read this book, or I gave money to this cause, or I did this. But the thing is, racism is not It's not an issue. It's a way of life. It's the way we live. And it requires kind of big changes for us individually and as a society to make things better. And the only way we're going to do that is if we know it's in our own self-interest to do it. If we know that we can live with our souls free, we can live a life that is freed and liberated from racism. So let me close with some thoughts about that. The tricky thing is that racism not being an issue, it means that to deal with racism, we have to live our values. We actually have to live as Christians. Well, that seems like a good thing. That to really live out who we know we are called to be, who God asks us to be. The helpful and exciting thing about the acronym is that when we stop denying our past, we gain a recognition with our own history, and we come to know who we are. You know, half of white people in this country have ancestry that were Klan or other white supremacist groups. That insight comes from Edward Ball, who wrote the book about my ancestry in the Klan. He said, he figured out, he just looked at the demographics and realized if there were 5 million people in the Klan back in the day, and that means that about half the people, half white people in the country have some ancestry that had that kind of belief. It's not all pretty, but if we want to recover our history as German or Scots or whatever you are, Irish or whatever, to know some of the hard things is also free. And we want to learn the good things too. We want to learn about the people in our past, the history of folks that have fought and tried to make things better, and to celebrate those people that have done that kind of work. And through the whole process, we come to know more deeply the power of God's grace, of God's love, of God's deep grace. So when we open our eyes, when we stop being blind, we also learn that racism has affected every part of our lives. When we stop trying to be colorblind, we are blessed with a new sense of truth, a new sense of having our feet on the ground, of being able to see our reality and all of reality. And we can work toward real repentance and real repair. We can support authentic change in our society when we accept God's sight and God's insight. And thirdly, when we give up our isolation and our individualism, we live into a kind of depth of community and connection that God fervently desires for all of humankind. We can create alliances with other people. And a church like this, I don't know what kind of alliances you have, but I've had people ask me over the years and feel really guilty. They'd say, well, we need more Black people in our group. We need more Black people in our organization to show that we're good people, to show that we're okay. Well, when we give up our isolation, we can make alliances with Black churches. We can make alliances with Black organizations. We can work in ways that make change possible. And so we talk in church all the time about being welcoming, but we hardly even know how good that can be, to live in real, authentic connectedness with God's love. It's not just about welcoming people, it's about living in connection, no matter who we are and what our group is. Some people in my neighborhood I lived down in West Philadelphia, and some people in my neighborhood, they used to have bumper stickers on their car that said, "Heaven is a mixed neighborhood." I always appreciated that. Heaven is a mixed neighborhood. So finally, we by having the courage to end our denial, to learn to see, to be building community beyond our isolation, we can have the courage to move out into the world without fear. We can have the courage to move past our fear and terror and projection to create peace. Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be wonderful? To live in peace, even in the midst of a harsh world, even when we're a little scared, to work towards love. Oh, wouldn't that be great? May it be so. May we do it. May we find our way past our DeBIT, past our debility, to real love. Amen.